I would like to thank Elena again for the invitation to participate in this so nice meeting, so instigating, exciting. I'm very happy to be here in Moscow again. The first results of this research were presented here during a meeting organizing commemorating 100 years of Vasilyev's work. And I presented the beginning of this research at the Moscow State University. But the result of this work for about nowadays more than 10 years working on the subject is that book in Portuguese. I will show at the end. There is a volume I would like to give Elena. It's in Portuguese, but you may leave at the library. Vasilkov has one. In fact, this work began when a student, a master's student of Newton da Costa, asked me if he could take the PhD with me. He took all our courses in logic, basic. We have a very strict PhD program. But finally, he said to me that he would like something about the history of paraconsistent logic. And then the first plan was to produce a work on the history of paraconsistent logic. But we began looking for signs of paraconsistency in authors from ancient times, medieval times, until the creation of paraconsistent logic in the 20th century. But the work became so interesting that the subject was changed. Instead of writing a history of paraconsistent logic, we decided to continue the work on the history of paraconsistency in the Western thought. I will present here very generally the results of the book until at the end that the book is being translated into English, an extended version that is going to be published for about the end of the year, this year. The present state of paraconsistent logic attests to significant development, and its maturity permits a critical historical analysis of its development, having in view the appreciation of its historical roots and stages of formation. Our work attempts to discover how a truly paraconsistent perspective is constituted, as well as how logical principles, rules, and systems have expressed the various concepts of paraconsistency. In this way, we may ask ourselves if logical principles and rules, according to which not everything may be deduced from a contradiction or something may be rejected, were conceived and evoked within certain contexts and theoretical traditions. The study of the logical meaning of consistency and inconsistency is found throughout the various periods of the history of philosophy, science, and logic. Diverse authors have investigated the phenomena of contradiction, seeking to identify, understand, and neutralize its consequences for rational knowledge. Analyzing the historical precedents of paraconsistent logic before the 20th century, we can identify some unanswered questions. First of them, what ideas were proposed and debated with regard to consistency before the 20th century of the history of formal logic? Did such ideas influence later logical theories? Was there knowledge of logical rules and principles which allowed, in some contexts, for inconsistency to be dealt without trivialization? If such principles were known, how were these proto-principles stated, and in what way can they be related to the logical paraconsistent results and rules known today? Let's recall before beginning. Everybody knows that a theory is consistent if in the underlying language there is a symbol for negation and there is no formula A such that A and not A can be proved in the theory. It is inconsistent when this doesn't happen. A theory is trivial when every formula of its language can be proved, is a theorem. Every theory based on the Aristotelian classical logic, if it's inconsistent, it is trivial and vice versa. Every classical theory is inconsistent if and only if it's trivial. A logic is paraconsistent if it can be used as the underlying logic to inconsistent but non-trivial theories, which are called paraconsistent theories. Let's recall, we have several presentations of classical logic, but the laws known as the basic laws of the Aristotelian thought are the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of excluded middle, and reflexivity of identity. Aristotle claimed in several of his excerpts that the most important and basic of all principles was the principle of non-contradiction. Every theory or every logic grounded on the Aristotelian laws is such that it is very easy to prove immediately that these formulas are provable. They say, from A and not A, we obtain any B. Another way, from A and not A and not A implies B. This means that every logic, every theory based on Aristotelian principles is such that in the presence of one contradiction, it's not necessary to have several, we have the trivialization of the theory. Every formula can be proved. When working, it was very, very a surprise. We didn't find in any part of Aristotle's work the mention to this principle. He knew the danger of trivialization, but he never mentioned these formulas or these ideas in his works. This became being discussed during the Middle Ages, and the law, the principle, was known as ex falso sequitur quod libet. Some authors called it ex impossibile sequitur quod libet, and nowadays it is also known as the principle of explosion. In the presence of one contradiction, the logic of the theories explodes. We say the general definition for paraconsistent logic, a logic is paraconsistent when the principle ex falso sequitur quod libet is not valid in the logic. That is, theories based on paraconsistent logics are such that from a contradiction we have not the explosion. We may deal with the theory in the presence of contradictions without exploding the theory. Let's begin with logical paraconsistent elements in ancient authors. from contradiction and non-triviality from Heraclitus of Ephesus to Aristotle. Each in their own way, the contributions of Heraclitus of Ephesus and Parmenides of Elea are decisive for the later development of logic, particularly for having dealt with the question of inconsistency and consistency, and for having, in a certain way, placed the issue on the agenda of later philosophy, especially in the treatment of the theme by Plato and Aristotle. Heraclitus, writing in the 6th century before Christ, are known to us only through fragments which explain his famous theory of the harmony of opposites and are particularly important for the discussion of the annulment of the principle of non-contradiction attributed to Heraclitus by Aristotle, and for their influence on later discussion in ancient logic. The theory of the harmony of opposites is in need, according to us, to an interpretation which is more natural and in which the identity of opposites does not need to be denied. Heraclitus' ideas provoked a debate on the study of contradiction in rational knowledge and in logic. In relation to the history of paraconsistent logic, we may conclude that the ideas of Heraclitus can be seen as a rational system of explanation which, if formalized, can describe contradictory states without at the same time trivializing itself. Paradoxically, it's thanks Parmenides' contributions to classical logic that he is included in our work. His thought is known to us through fragments of the poem On Nature, where some may be interpreted as a proto-enunciation of the three fundamental canons of classical deductive axiomatic thought. Although the philosophical activity of Plato, in one way or another, took into account clearly logical schemes of inference, one cannot affirm that they studied logic for its own sake as an autonomous form of knowledge that he studied. But the contributions of Aristotle to the founding of logic and of scientific method have been amply celebrated. We argue that in the core of his theory of the syllogism, he describes some, Jan Wolensky will be angry against me. We argue that in the core of his theory of the syllogism, he describes some deductive schemes in which the presence of inconsistencies does not imply the trivialization of the logical theory involved. Though not explicit, the notion that Aristotle proposed results of a paraconsistent character is corroborated nowadays by various theoretical situations he examined. In the prior analytics, book B, 15, he explains how valid syllogisms based on opposite, contrary, or contradictory premises can be obtained. Aristotle further deepens his analysis of the syllogistic consequence by stating in the prior analytics that a true conclusion may be derived from false premises, and from opposite premises, contrary or contradictory, a valid conclusion may be derived in specific moods of the second and third figures. But he quotation, a valid negative conclusion. Very recently, I discovered that maybe Kolmogorov, when he introduced his first axiomatic for intuitionistic logics, he put A implies not A, implies not B. He put a kind of ex falso, but not strict, maybe on account of this Aristotle observation. These results are the basis for some of the rules for the evaluation of valid syllogisms, justify some consequentia in medieval logic, and are at the center of the debate of the ex falso sequitur quodlibet. Recently, based on the same except we mentioned, Priest in 2005 affirms that the syllogistic is paraconsistent. The earliest suggestion of this was presented by Da Costa and D'Ottaviano in 1998 in a published paper. And in chapter 11 of Book A of Posterior Analytics, Aristotle shows that the principle of non-contradiction is not a general presupposition for any demonstration whatever, but only for those in which the conclusion must be proved on its basis. And in a paper published in 2010 with the co-author of the book, we have showed that it is possible to interpret the Aristotelian demonstration of such part in the posterior analytics in contemporary terms, formalizing it in Da Costa's Paraconsistent First-Order Predicate Calculus C1. The paper was published by Principi, International Journal of Philosophy. It seems possible to interpret the syllogisms on the basis of opposite premises as in a broad paraconsistent theory. So, we suggest in the book that the role of Aristotle in the prehistory of paraconsistent logics seems to be much more important than is customarily admitted. In the book, we have a special session concerning the Stoics, the logic in the Stoics, but we are changing the approach for the English version. Let's go to the logical paraconsistent elements in medieval authors. Here, the research was marvelous. We became very involved. And we present, based on some key authors of the medieval period, considerations and results related to contradiction and the ex falso sequitur quodlibet that are pertinent to a history of paraconsistent logic. Boëtius, in the 5th century, left seminal elements for the various positions for and against the ex falso that are found in the scholastic phase of medieval logic. Boëtius attracted the attention because of a passage that was very important in the conceptual construction of the ex falso, exactly the passage I have called also attention. Boëtius concisely describes Aristotle's steps in the first chapters of Book B of Prior Analytics, analyzing the case in which a syllogism can have two false premises and a true conclusion. One sees in the era of scholastic logic an intense debate on the validity of the ex falso at the center of the doctrine of topics, theories of implication, and duties disputes. The first writers to mention the ex falso sequitur quodlibet or ex impossibile sequitur quodlibet were Garlando Compostista in the 11th century and Peter Abelard. In fact, we bought the book by Garlando Compostista, the only work he left. We tried to find, it's mentioned by some authors, but we didn't find until now where Garlando Compostista mentions the ex falso. And the terms ex falso sequitur quodlibet are not mentioned by Garlando Compostista. But we are trying to look at the rational, the logical study, even if he doesn't mention the name of the law. From the 13th century, there was intense debate concerning the validity of some consequentia that were later accepted, and one finds the quarrel over the legitimacy of the ex falso. It's in the context of topical inferences and maximal propositions that the rejection of the ex falso by Peter Abelard is evident. His topical investigation, this was a surprise, it's not mentioned in the literature, leads Abelard to propose new semantic criteria for the notion of necessary consequence, consecutio necessitas, understood by some medieval authors in the manner of contemporary material implication. Abelard suggests explicitly that a stricter notion of consecutio is necessary. He says the antecedent of a true declarative conditional sentence requires the consequence intrinsically. For Abelard, explicitly he claims the ex falso is not valid, and from the false and from the impossible, any consequent whatever does not truly follow. And so, according to his tests, the accepts to have studied, relevant and paraconsistent elements seem to orient Abelard's logical options. Some other medieval authors of the 13th century objected also to the ex falso. The veto on the ex falso can be placed within the panorama of a not a logical approach, a metaphysical, logical, epistemological approach of a consistent character. Among the authors, opponents of the ex falso, we may mention Robert of Melun, impossible to find a photo, Petrus Hispanus, William of Ockham, she's not here, William of Ockham, Henry of Ghent. Petrus Hispanus was the unique Portuguese Papa of Catholic Church, but he's known as Petrus Hispanus. And he...
It's not clear he was Portuguese.
No, there is a discussion if he would be the Portuguese priest or a priest from Sevilla. There is a quarrel in the literature. I like more the first option, but it's not, nobody knows. And also several tests attributed to Petrus seems not to be, but there is a style that can be recognized. Okay, Priest also studies on this subject. He mentioned in a paper that the ex falso was discussed and introduced for the first time by William de Soissons of Soissons. But it's not true, because Petrus Abelardus first discussed the rule, but against the rule. And John of Salisbury, who lived after Peter Abelard, attributes to Adam of Bauscham, his contemporary, the thesis that from a contradiction follows the same, as mentioned, as written by Aristotle, idem esse ex contradictione, a thesis which implies the ex falso, which generalizes the ex falso. But everybody has studied the ex falso as the law of Duns Scotus. Several books, you can, until now, we read this. But at the beginning of the 20th century, the ex falso was attributed to John Duns Scotus, because a clear and proficient statement of this logical law is found in two of his commentaries. However, we discovered that based on an examination of the material initiated around 1936 by Lompré, these works attributed to Duns Scotus were attributed to another author, an unknown author that was called Pseudo-Scotus. This new viewpoint was sanctioned by the Vatican edition of Scotus' Opera Omnia that began to be published in 1950. But this understanding of the issue has prevailed to the present day, that the law was of Duns Scotus, because Łukasiewicz, the so respectable, one of the fathers of logic of 20th century, in 1951, not having taken into account these revisions in his celebrated study of the Aristotelian syllogism, promulgated the hypothesis that the ex falso, that he called the law of Duns Scotus, should be attributed to the Doctor Subtilis, Duns Scotus. Due to the prestige of the great Polish logician and historian, this eponymous solution was replicated by numerous other scholars. But who was Pseudo-Scotus? Pseudo-Scotus is one of the most intriguing personalities in the history of logic. Wise and talented, he developed in an extremely elegant way various logical theories typical of his period. Although Pseudo-Scotus was not the first to enunciate the ex falso, Peter Abelard worked with this more than 200 years before him. Was for some time during our era admitted as such. The argumentation of the author explained in part the merit achieved by this exposition. Aside from the ex falso, some of its corollaries are stated in his conclusions. As it may be seen, at this point in the development of medieval logic, the ex falso had been completely integrated into the well-developed theory of the consequentia as we find in Pseudo-Scotus. The elegance of his treatment attests to the very mature development of the logical classical paradigm, in this case in detriment to other perspectives such as those of relevance and paraconsistency. In the book, we studied carefully the tests left by this Pseudo-Scotus, and we translated into a formal language the beautiful proof he gave for the first time, justifying the laws from the Aristotelian three basic laws. In fact, when we give courses about introduction of logic, the proof we give for the students was presented by Pseudo-Scotus. To the extent that logical classical citizenship may be considered to the rule, there is a logical classical solution to the conflict. On the other hand, in rejecting the ex falso and the logical classical solution to the phenomenon of contradiction, various authors have delineated an alternative approach which encompasses elements pertinent to the paradigm now known as paraconsistent. Modern authors are more easily brought to accept as decisive the methodological criterion of logical classical coinage, according to which any inconsistencies or contradictions inevitably bring the rational theory in which they occur to falsity, to triviality. This predominance in the modern period will only be definitively reconsidered with the advent of contemporary paraconsistency. And let's go. Here is Jaskowski, Aida Huda, and Newton da Costa. And the book with the papers by Vasiliev on logic was published for the first time by a collection. I am the editor of the Center for Logic, because the last work left by Aida Huda was the translation of Vasiliev's papers from Russian to Portuguese. The context of logic in the modern era is in fact philosophically complex and formally poor. The sparse logical formal elements cultivated in the 16th and 17th Europe reflect the distinct medieval logical traditions. Modern scholars, famous for their contributions to philosophy, incorporate very little formal logic in their theoretical elaborations. We discuss in the book the role of inconsistency in some of Leibniz's theory and in the rationalist system of Christian Wolff. We also discuss the apagogic strategy in Hume and counter-apagogic methods and non-contradiction. But the role of contradiction in speculative philosophy of Hegel has a special approach in the book. We call attention to Hegel's position and contribution to rehabilitating the role of contradiction in knowledge, reopening the philosophic trail so that other theoreticians could seriously consider the role of contradiction in broad rational contexts. At the beginning of the 20th century, particular importance must be attributed to the rebirth of the study of logic metaphysics, and ontology, the foundations of mathematics and science, especially in Central Europe. The mathematical environment of the 19th century is notable, above all, for the advent of non-Euclidean geometries, motivating a similar attitude in logic and facilitating the creative freedom that is so characteristic of logical contributions of the 20th century, which have shown, which have shown themselves to be extremely fruitful, especially in relation to non-classical logic. Jan Łukasiewicz is one of the great names of contemporary logic, and the importance of his contributions is recognized by various scholars of the present day, in logic as well as in philosophy. Łukasiewicz employs his analysis of the principle of non-contradiction in a very well-known paper published in 1910 in German, but there is the book in Polish on the principle of non-contradiction. It's almost appeared in the first English translation of the book by a student of Priest. And he ends by concluding that it's logically dispensable, the principle of non-contradiction. In this sense, the Polish scholar clearly sees the path to a project for non-Aristotelian logics in which the later principle no longer holds. His conclusions directly influenced the appearance of the first paraconsistent logical systems, especially within the Polish school of logic. Nikolai Vasiliev, professor of philosophy in Kazan, defended a bold non-classical logical theoretical project with original ideas and suggestion. In 1912, he outlines an explicit project of alternative heterodox non-classical logics. His ideas united the paraconsistence, many-valued, and intentional approaches. Other scholars will realize the plans of Łukasiewicz and Vasiliev. The mathematical milieu of the 19th century and the advent of mathematical logic at the beginning of the 20th century, with its appropriate tools, made these steps possible, firm, and successful. As a consequence of the historiographical premises we have assumed in the research, we consider Stanisław Jaśkowski and Newton da Costa the creators of paraconsistent logic. Motivated by problems arising from the presence of contradictions in specific rational contexts, they proposed and developed axiomatic logical systems capable of dealing with contradictions and inconsistencies without a trivialization of the implied theory. Stanisław Jaśkowski, motivated by Hegelian and Marxist interpretations of contradiction, introduced by two papers in 1948 and 49, his logic D2, known as discursive logic, which tolerates contradictions. The motivation for this logic derives from the fact that the presence of contradictory statements in ordinary language is common, and the use of contradictory hypotheses is often necessary for the explanation of phenomena in scientific theories. Newton da Costa, but the papers by Jaśkowski appeared in English only in 1969, and Newton da Costa in 1963 is very clear in proposing his hierarchies of paraconsistent logics as alternative axiomatic logical systems, developing as well logics of a higher order that are able to overcome the limitations that contradictions impose on rational theories in the logical classical paradigm. In this context, aside from the fact that Da Costa and Jaśkowski fit the criteria of intentional and semantic paraconsistency, the contribution of these two authors called the attention of the community of logicians to a new investigative program which delineated, little by little, the shape of the present-day field of paraconsistent logic. The initial proposals for paraconsistent systems encourage many scholars to study paraconsistency in its variety of forms, including those arising from relevance logics, modal logics, fuzzy logics, and others, and these have been pursued by researchers of various nationalities and continents, especially in Belgium, Australia, Italy, Russia, Israel, and the United States. Da Costa, his disciples and collaborators from several countries have introduced many paraconsistent systems and obtained relevant results concerning algebraic structures associated to such systems, paraconsistent set theories, model theory, logics of higher order, paraconsistent differential calculus, and some applications to theories based on semantically closed languages, ethics, other non-classical logics, theory of probability, foundations of the infinitesimal calculus, and quantum mechanics, cognitive science, computer science, translations, and combinations of logics. Paraconsistency has become a field of knowledge, interrelating distinct schools of paraconsistent logic, and there are applications of paraconsistent logic not only to the foundations of science and its philosophical analysis, but even to informatics and technology. And according, on account of Da Costa, we have a Brazilian school of logic. Here is Aida Ruda, the first Da Costa collaborator. Sam Youngers, he is Newton. Here is Décio Krause, the new students, Aida Ruda. And it's precisely from this perspective that we have studied the initial and general development of paraconsistent logic, with an emphasis on the history of Newton da Costa's paraconsistent systems, as well as his contributions to the inauguration of this field of logic in the 20th century. The research was published as a book with 712 pages. It was published by Unicamp University Press and Coleção Clé of the Center for Logic. Evandro Luiz Gomes, my former PhD student, is my co-author in the book. The book has 2 parts, 4 chapters. The title is Beyond the Columns of Hercules, A History of Paraconsistence from Heraclitus to Newton da Costa. The title is an allusion to the epic metaphor of surpassing limits, such as the founders of paraconsistency have made, transcending classical limits of logicity. And we are working very, very hard in the English version of the book. It will appear soon, for about 1,000 pages. Will be published by Santesi Library book series. The title will be Illuminating Contradiction, A History of Paraconsistency from Heraclitus of Ephesus to Newton da Costa. And in this English version, we will have an appendix with interviews given by the most relevant representatives of the different paraconsistent schools, contemporary paraconsistent schools, and some special invited, some special relevant names of the logic of our century. And here we have 2 people who gave us interview, Vasilkov and Professor Wolensky. And it is an honor having their interviews. What more? It's very difficult to translate because, especially in the period relative to medieval times, the excerpts in Latin, most of them, of the authors we have researched, there are not translations into English. Some of the excerpts are unknown, and it's been very difficult to translate from Latin to English. But we expect that the book will be a very, very beautiful book. And thank you. Спасибо.